Evening and welcome to Bible study for today, Wednesday, the 5th of October of 2022. I'm the Reverend James Merriam at the Wells River Congregational Church, and so it is my privilege and pleasure to extend to each and every one of you, wherever and whenever you find yourself joining in this Bible study, joining in this time of devotion, joining in this time of reflection, that you are welcome here, that you are beloved and you are beloved and wonderful in the sight of God, and that we are glad to have you joining us for this time. This is Bible study. This is the opportunity to dive into a piece of scripture that we otherwise might not get the particular chance to. Even with the 3-year cycle that includes 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different readings for each Sunday, and even other cycles that include a reading for every day of the year or every day of a multi-year cycle, we don't get through all the scripture, and we certainly don't get through, give the sort of attention that we otherwise might to all kinds of different passages. So we take this time and we begin on really the lifelong journey of trying to delve into as much of scripture as possible, as far and as broad and as big and as wide, and yet also as particular, as deep and as caring as we can be about particular verses, particular passages, particular stories, and especially those things that challenge us or challenged people years ago, to remember the difficulty that different people have had of reading scripture into their own times, the challenge that they've had when they read their own times into scripture, and the balance and interplay that come between those. So today we're going to be reading from Jeremiah, the longest by word count, or in its original Hebrew, of the prophets, the second of the 3 sort of greater prophets, that is the greater in the sense of being more verbose, though of course they were also extremely important. The most important prophet, of course, Elijah, does not really have any writings by him, and we have a somewhat limited amount of information about him, really. It's only recorded in the books of the Kings from sort of a relationship with the royal family perspective. But we have these huge amounts of writing from these later prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and this is from the second of them. And this is from Jeremiah, who was the prophet who overlapped with the full collapse of the old order in the world, and overlapped really with the compilation and writing down and sort of solidification and canonization and setting, in many contexts, of the stories and of the books of scripture in the Old Testament. Almost all of them, actually. These were all really sort of stories that were sort of around, that were being talked about, that were known to many, that were upheld by different schools of thought in more and less prominent ways, and were treated as all kinds of different things, but then got put together as sort of this emergency history, this emergency record of who they were and their relationship with God, because that was suddenly under threat. Because of the exile in Babylon. And what we have is, in this particular verse, in this particular chapter, something in the extensive back and forth about sort of developing and the outlook of a people who, after it appears their entire society has fallen apart, as it appears everything they knew and trusted and believed in and thought would last forever, and had prophets of all different kinds and leaders of all different kinds saying it would last forever, priests and scribes and Levites of all different kinds talking about God's kingdom going on forever, and then right in front of their eyes it doesn't. Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians took everyone of cultural or military importance into exile, took them all back to Babylon in what is now Iraq, and sort of had an area for them to live. So they lived together in exile. So you have 2 different groups. You have the people who were taken away, and you have the people who were left behind, both trying to figure out how to continue to be the people of God, to continue to be the Hebrew people, and really, even if it's worth doing that, even if it's worth trying. At the same time, you have the prophet Jeremiah, who fled before the city was captured, or as the city was being captured, fled into Egypt, which is, of course, a rival great empire, a rival of the Babylonian Empire. And so it was sort of, as with every conquest that has happened in basically all of history, some people are captured, some people welcome the conquest, and some people resist the conquest and just travel to whatever other power, whatever other force they think they might be able to either seek shelter under or encourage that force to see it, that empire, to see it as being in their national interest to fight back against the conqueror. We see this all the time, and we see this right up to the present day. People who defect, people who seek political asylum from Russia in the United States, from the United States in Russia. All that kind of thing, all over the place. And really, throughout history, you've always had, all the time, different national interests, both even in multiple different places, trying to encourage nearby empires, nearby powerful nations, to either free them from another empire, support them, or change the leadership so that the people who are in exile can be in control instead. Interference in one another's nations is not a new thing. With the CIA and the KGB in the 20th century, certainly those two forces, those two secret services, took it to a greater level, and have a far wider scope, really kind of being everywhere in the entire world. To the point that even the accusation of interfering in one another is very politically powerful. We hear that literally right now going on in Iran, where there's a huge human rights and especially women's rights protests going on, but the leadership are accusing that of just being outside nations trying to interfere on behalf of their own particular interests, and that these protests are not real. They're completely fake. Jeremiah is here in Egypt, is in his own exile in Egypt, in the rival of Babylon, writing, or he's probably dictating to his assistant Baruch, who is known to have both written some pieces that are usually not included in our scripture, at least, and is thought to have written, or is attributed as having written quite a lot of the book of Jeremiah. So this is probably a dictated letter. And actually we begin with saying that this is, the word that's used is book, or is often translated as book, but it just means, because really books, specifically as we know them, only go back, or were sort of an invention of what is it? It's about 1,000 years ago. Because before that you had all kinds of different forms. You had scrolls and all kinds of different things. And it really comes from revolutions in paper making, to make paper plentiful and cheap enough that you could actually have a whole bunch of paper bound up and tied together into a big book, and that it wasn't so precious that it needed to be used in some other way, or protected in the form of a scroll. So this is a letter, and this translation actually chooses to use the word missive, which is an English word sort of meaning like open letter and also instructive letter, like almost an order from a government agency of some kind, but an instructional letter sent from Jeremiah in exile in Egypt to the people generally who are in exile in Babylon. So this is instructions for the people who are in Babylon, not the people who are still in Jerusalem and Judea. And so this is instructions for the culturally and militarily important people who were the leadership. It's thought it was between 10 and 20% of the population. People who had been the leaders in Jerusalem, in Judea, who are now in Babylon. So normally this passage is read with a big section in the middle cut out because there's a lot of long and complicated names. But the long and complicated names are how we situate what's happening, where in time this is, who is being written to, and what the circumstances of their being written to. So this is chapter 29, Jeremiah, and I'm going to read about about half or so of this chapter, and we'll explain why in a second. And these are the words of the missive that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the rest of the elders of the exile, and to the priests, and to the prophets, and to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had exiled from Jerusalem to Babylonia. After King Jeconiah and the queen mother and the eunuchs, the nobles of Judah and the craftsmen and the smiths had gone out from Jerusalem by the hand of Elash, son of Shapha, and Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, had sent to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylonia, saying, Thus said the Lord of armies, God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I exiled to Babylonia, Build houses and dwell in them, and plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and daughters, and give your daughters to husbands, and let them bear sons and daughters, and multiply there and do not dwindle. And seek the welfare of the city to which I exile you, and pray for it to the Lord. For through its welfare you shall have welfare. For thus said the Lord of armies, God of Israel, Let not your prophets who are in your midst delude you, or your soothsayers, and do not listen to your dreams that you dream. For with lies do they prophesy to you in my name. I have not sent them, said the Lord. For thus said the Lord, When 70 years are fulfilled for Babylonia, I will single you out and bring about my good word to return you to this place. For I surely know the plan that I have desired for you, said the Lord, plans for peace and not for evil, to give you a future and hope. And you shall call me and go and pray to me, and I will listen to you. And you shall look for me and find me when you seek me in all your heart. And I will be found for you and restore your fortunes. And I will gather you from all nations and from all places where I scattered you, said the Lord. And I will bring you back to the place from which I exiled you. For you, though, that's where I'm going to stop. So, missive letter from Jeremiah written to the people in exile in Babylon, calling out explicitly who was sent into exile, the particular royal leadership, the priests, the scribes, and the craftsmen and smiths. So this is to take away the nation's ability to worship in its traditional places. You separate the people who do the worshiping from the places where the worship happens, and to separate all the people who can make weapons from the people who could use the weapons, basically, and those who could command them. So you have all the sort of normal people who would be conscripted into the army are still back in Jerusalem, but they don't have any weapons, and they don't have any leadership, and they still control sort of the sacred places, even though the sacred places have been destroyed or they've been converted over into Babylonian style sacred places. But there's no leadership, there's no memory, there's no history, and instead only the Babylonian history is being shared in the land, and the people who are in exile in Babylon are surrounded by Babylonian land, culture, and history. And the question is, this culture, this power, this history, as they spend time in Babylonia, is going to infiltrate into the society. It will sort of happen inevitably. Just being in that culture, being surrounded in that culture, the two cultures will mix over time. And it's the question of, is this sort of a good thing, or is this something to be resisted as far as humanly possible? Even beyond that, is this a time is this basically an acceptance of the end of the culture and the nation and the society, and should people try to spare themselves and their families the pain of the death and decline and dissolution of their culture into the surrounding larger culture, or should they do that by trying to end their society right then, either by cutting off instruction in their society and adopting the surrounding society as quickly and as completely as possible, or by not having any more children, by despairing and just weeping and wailing and being morose and sad about what's going on, and just sort of living out to the end of their lives in mourning, in effect. We have last week we read the psalm that talks about down by the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept for thee, Zion. And we hear sort of these conflicting interpretations of whether it was that's a hymn about giving up and bemoaning the loss of Zion, the fact that we're abandoning our culture and we can only have have the few memories that we have left, or whether it's about active resistance, actively trying to keep up and actively trying to have symbolic resistance to the culture around by singing songs in our traditional language that the surrounding culture doesn't understand, that poke fun and attack the culture around us without actually attacking. These two passages, that from last week and that from this week, do agree in one fundamental way, and that is actual acts of resistance and violence are futile because without the assistance of God, Babylon is just far, far, far too powerful. We already saw that happen in the world. And that this is a lesson of some kind, though it's hard to figure out what kind, that is being taught to the nation. And that after some period of time, things are going to change again, and there will be a kingdom and a Jewish people, a kingdom of Judea again, with Jerusalem at its center, and there will be a new era in one kind or another. What we have also is that just before this, in chapter 28, we have the conflict between Jeremiah and Hananiah is saying that the exile will last 2 years, and now Jeremiah is responding to that by saying that the exile will last 70 years. This, of course, is a very big difference, and a very big difference in the approach of how we should approach responding and handling a situation, because 70 years is a lot longer than 2, and 70 years is symbolically representative of being 3 generations and getting on towards about how far the limits of a long, healthy human life in those days, and to some extent getting close in our day, that a person who was a young man, like a youth or an adolescent, will be a very, very, very old man. Somebody who remembered Jerusalem in its old time as an adult, or like just barely as an adult. Maybe the oldest of the old people will actually remember from one to the other. But 3 complete generations will come up into adulthood in between the fall of Jerusalem and the return. This is symbolic. It's sort of the limit of active memory. When you get up to about 100 years or more, you end up with the limit of inactive memory, which is sort of about how long a society can remember events that aren't written down, that are trying to be suppressed, because that's about the limit of how long you get from I knew someone who was there, to transfers of the knowledge. Like my grandfather's grandfather, or more meaningfully, my grandmother's grandmother, as often oral histories are passed. 100 years, so 3 generations twice, so 5 generations spanned over about 100 years. So what we have here is Jeremiah pushing back against Hananiah's overly positive thing, and the fact that if we're expecting it just to be 2 years, we'll approach things really differently, and we won't want to have any children, we won't want to have any marriages, we won't want to have anything in our culture happen in Babylon, because probably when we come back after 2 years, we'll just start over, we'll reset, we'll be ready to go again. Everything that happened in the exile will just be like a bad dream, and we'll just put it aside and not worry about it. So let's not do anything while we're here. Let's just wait. Jeremiah is saying, no, don't just wait, because if you're in the words that were used by the Wesley brothers, if you tarry till you're better, if you wait until everything is perfect, you will never come at all. You'll never show up at all. You never do anything at all, unless things are really perfect. So Jeremiah is saying, be fully yourselves, be fully your culture, do everything you possibly can, and do everything you can to support it, and your well-being, your physical well-being, along with your spiritual well-being, and pray for the city where you are in exile, do whatever you can in support, because that city's success is also your success. And trust in God that in not the sort of short period of time where it's like a bad dream, but in the long period of time where there will be community memories, but there is time for the nation to gain strength because of the riches of Babylon, because of the opportunity they have. That the people in exile need to trust the people who are still in Jerusalem. The people in Jerusalem need to trust the people who are still in exile, despite that there's, on purpose, no real communication between them. And that after this set period of time, things will be restored to how they are. Now, the exile lasted closer to 90 years, so just barely on the far, far outside of one human memory. But this 70 term is close, like it's pretty close. And you can put dates that are beginning and end of the exile that are about 70 years apart. Now, of course, centuries later, the prophet Daniel, in his Apocalypse, wrote that this 70 was actually a metaphor for 70 sets of 7 years, which is, of course, a doubly symbolic term and one number, and one that Jesus would use for in his talking about forgiveness, 70 times 7. And that takes us from about the time of the exile to about the time of Daniel, who lived in Persia and was as part of the diaspora, the spread out remnants, or the spread out portions of the community that lived not only in Jerusalem and Judea, but continued to worship outside of that land, thus decoupling worship from the particular land. Because when the exile ended, not everyone went home. There were lots of people who had sought refuge in Egypt and had become very comfortable there and stayed there. There were people who had gotten very comfortable in Babylon, and especially when the new Persian regime came in, when Babylon fell and they were allowed to go home, but they came into this privileged position in society because the Persians were very pro-Judeans, and we hear in the story of Esther that they became very, very prominent in Persian society. So there's a lot of reason to stay. So you end up with members of this community who were really everywhere, and being kind of the first nation to be able to exist as a faith and a nation and a culture in foreign lands. It became this minority in other lands and the majority in their own land for centuries following that, and set up the long running idea of diaspora, which is huge in Jewish faith, and really has become so normal in Christian faith that we don't really think about it. That of course you can be a Christian as a minority within your community, or even beyond that, in mixed countries where there are a lot of different kinds of Christians, that you can be your kind of Christian while your neighbor is a different kind of Christian, because a lot of the time we're more vicious towards one another than we are towards our enemies. But that goes back a long way, and that's a whole other story. So for those who led the way through difficult times, and those who called upon us to find whatever joy in life and to seek the well-being of our neighbors who look different, pray differently, act differently, and are of a different culture than we are, there's quite a bit to apply to our present day, isn't there, in that? So thanks be to Jeremiah. Whoever you are, wherever you are in life's journey, you are welcome here. You are blessed. You are a beloved child of God. And thanks be to God for that. Take care, everyone.